Robert Montgomery was the star who never quite was. He was a divided personality, the debonair who became a tough guy, the aristocrat who fought for the working people and then turned his back on them, and the easygoing character actor who alienated his co-stars and terrified a daughter who, to many, became an even bigger star than he. His career as an actor was a classic case of studio persecution sinking his promising career. In Montgomery's case, it was not only due to his populist politics, but also the day he made a dark threat against one of the most powerful men in all of Hollywood history. Once he had spoken the fateful words, it was not only his career under threat, but also his life. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Robert Montgomery, originally named Henry Montgomery Jr., entered the world on May 21, 1904, in Fishkill Landing, located in Dutchess County along the Hudson River in New York. He was the first of two sons born to Henry and Mary Weed Bernard Montgomery. His father, Henry Sr., held the position of vice president at the New York Rubber Company. For much of his career, Henry Sr. was a serious success. This affluence afforded the family the finest clothing, housing, and education. Their lifestyle included lavish European vacations that could stretch for months. The Montgomery home was set in a countryside rich with wild game, and the nearby Hudson River teemed with fish. Beyond his childhood lessons, which were leisurely delivered by a private tutor, Henry Jr. developed a variety of gentlemanly skills. He became a talented sharpshooter, a skilled fisherman, and a competent writer. At the age of 15, he was enrolled in the prestigious Pauling School for Boys in Pauling, New York. Years later, while looking back on his school years for an MGM studio biography, he said, "When I was in school, I was one of those unfortunates who never seemed to belong. I used to envy with all my heart the other boys who displayed no trace of inner trepidation, who laughed and talked easily among themselves and to strangers. At night, I would think of all the smart, wisecracking things I would say the next day. Then when the opportunity came, my tongue seemed to be tied. I actually suffered when I had to meet strangers." At Pauling School, Henry Jr. developed a keen interest in writing, eventually becoming one of the editors of the school newspaper. It was a life of luxury, sport, and learning for a to-the-manor-born young American. However, unlike European aristocrats of the era, wealthy Americans were in a more precarious position. Despite their exorbitant wealth, all it took was one stock market disaster or a few bad investments and the rug could be pulled from under them. And that is just what happened to Henry Montgomery Sr. The New York Rubber Corporation, one of the oldest factories in Beacon, was established in 1851 in Matawan, now part of Beacon. The factory produced a wide range of rubber goods from balls to belting. In 1922, when Henry Jr. was just 18, rubber stock crumbled and the company's value plummeted. Henry Sr.'s entire wealth was plowed into rubber, and he went from prince to pauper overnight. The shame and burden of this financial collapse was too much for him, and tragically, he ended his life by throwing himself from the Brooklyn Bridge. After the estate was swiftly assessed, Montgomery's creditors were paid off and the family was informed of their financial collapse. The widow, Mary Montgomery, and her two sons learned they were no longer comfortably well off, but instead dangerously close to poverty. Mary, along with her younger son Donald, had to turn to relatives for support. Meanwhile, Henry had to leave school and find work, any work, as he had no specialized training or degree to guide him. His first job was with the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, where he worked as a mechanic. His task was to tap railway wheels for overheated journal boxes, a job a long way removed from the career he had once assumed he would fall into. Though some relatives offered to fund his education at Princeton University, they had conditions. They hoped he would pursue law or business, stable careers in their eyes. However, Henry made it clear that his passion lay in writing. His relatives were unimpressed by the idea of supporting him through college for such an uncertain career, and their offer was withdrawn. With few options, he stuck with a railroad job, managing to save a small sum that allowed him to move to New York City in 1922. In the city, he found a modest room in Greenwich Village, bought a second-hand typewriter, and began writing short stories, many of which were inspired by the sea. He worked tirelessly, submitting his stories to magazines and publishers, only to be hit with constant rejection. As the rejections mounted, so did his poverty. His diet often consisted solely of milk. By the end of the year, Henry was penniless. He accepted a position aboard the Caddo, a standard oil tanker, and he hoped to draw from his sea experiences for future stories. However, life on the tanker was so monotonous that he spent most of his free time sleeping rather than writing. After completing a trip around the world, he returned to Greenwich Village to resume his writing. This time, however, he balanced it with short-term jobs to make ends meet. Among his friends in the village was Sam Janey, an actor-playwright who had recently landed a role as assistant stage manager for a play called The Mask and the Face, starring William Faversham, which premiered in 1924. Janey believed that Henry had the potential to be an actor and convinced his employers to let Henry try out for minor roles in the production. At first, Henry wasn't particularly interested in acting, but he needed the work, as none of his stories had been sold. After a few days of rehearsal, however, Henry became fascinated by the world of theater. He told himself he was there only to learn the craft of drama for the sake of writing plays. But as he later confessed in a 1939 interview with Collier's, "Of course I was kidding myself. From the time I stepped on that stage, I wanted to act. I didn't know myself for a long while, but finally I caught on. After that, nothing counted but the stage." Despite the mixed reception of The Mask and the Face, Henry was thrilled by the opportunity. In the production, he was given 5 walk-on parts, each paying $5 a day, along with 2 offstage voice roles at $10 a day. But after just 9 performances, the show's star, William Faversham, had Henry fired. Faversham, convinced the young actor wasn't cut out for the stage, dismissed him with this curt advice: "The march of trade is yearning for young men like you, and my advice to you is to get out and stay out of the theater." The play itself was soon closed after just 4 more performances. Henry's brief stint on stage left him with the acting bug, and the allure of both the craft and the potential financial rewards was irresistible. He realized that his name, especially with all the Y's, wasn't quite right for an actor, so he decided to change it to Robert, inspired by one of his characters from The Mask and the Face. Later that year, Robert landed a role as Lewis Rhodes in Dawn, a drama by Tom Barry at the Harris Theater. The play, set over a 48-hour period, focused on a jazz-age flapper played by Zita Joanne. Robert's performance was solid, and he also found himself falling in love with his co-star, the stunning Elizabeth Bryan Allen. The following spring, Robert played Blink in The Complex, a play by Louis E. Bush that explored the then-novel concept of psychoanalysis. His career continued to build, and he eventually begged to join a stock company in Rochester, New York. It was there that Robert realized he had been approaching his acting career the wrong way. "I started out wrong with the idea that all I had to do to become an actor was to appear in plays in New York. It was a silly idea, going at the thing backwards," he confessed. Living in poverty, Robert still made the most of his situation. He slept at the rehearsal hall on a quilted piano cover, carrying his safety razor and toothbrush in his pockets. A sympathetic cleaning woman brought him fresh coffee each morning. Despite these hardships, Robert managed to maintain his appearance. He even wore lemon-tinted gloves borrowed from the show's art director, Joe Mullen. Mullen later remarked, "Bob was the glummest man in the world when he was completely broke, but if he had $1, he was the gayest youngster in town. I never met anybody else that could get so effervescent on $1. It was said that Robert could make a $15 suit look as if it cost 10 times that amount. By 1928, Robert had returned to the Broadway stage with newfound confidence. He married Elizabeth Bryan Allen, whom he had continued to court after their time in Dawn, on April 14, 1928. That summer, he performed in a stock production of The Bad Man, before landing a role in Edgar Selwyn's comedy, Possession. It was during one of the 37 performances of Possession that a talent scout from Samuel Goldwyn's studio spotted Robert and saw potential for the screen. He arranged for Robert and his now pregnant wife to travel to Hollywood for a screen test, opposite the beautiful Vilma Benke for This Is Heaven. The results did not impress Samuel Goldwyn. The mogul felt Robert was too thin, and next to Benke looked too young to be a viable leading man. Suggestions were made to make him appear more mature, including the possibility of a mustache. However, by then Goldwyn had begun to doubt the future of sound films, and decided to produce This Is Heaven as a silent film with only sound effects and a musical score. With this change, there was less need for a leading man who could speak, and Robert, disillusioned, chose to walk away from the role. The part was eventually given to James Hall, and Robert was momentarily forgotten. Thanks to Edgar Selwyn, the director and writer of Possession, Robert nailed his first big break in Hollywood. Selwyn convinced his brother-in-law Joseph M. Schenck, a top executive at United Artists, to cast Montgomery in the studio's upcoming talking version of the comedy melodrama 3 Live Ghosts. Montgomery took on the role of William Foster, a smooth-talking American on the run for embezzling money from his father's company. Though it marked his feature debut, 3 Live Ghosts was actually the 4th film Montgomery had completed. Meanwhile, Nicholas Schenck, Joseph's brother, and a powerful figure at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, saw Montgomery's screen test and was impressed. He managed to persuade studio chief Louis B. Mayer and other executives to sign the actor to a 5-year contract at $350 a week. Robert's first big role under his new deal came in 1929's So This Is College. Montgomery receives second billing as Biff, a charming and energetic playboy who becomes a college football player. To appear more athletic, he was outfitted with shoulder and arm padding. As Robert's career began to gain traction in 1929, there was additional happiness at home. He and his wife welcomed a daughter. The child's name and birth date were never disclosed to the public. As a New York stage actor with a polished voice, he was seen as a threat by established silent film stars, whose careers were waning with the arrival of sound. His perfect enunciation and youthful voice were admired, but also resented by many of these former silent film luminaries. His high society background didn't help either, as it made him appear aloof and out of touch with the Hollywood crowd. The fact that Robert was intellectually and culturally superior to many of his peers only added to his unpopularity. This disconnect would continue to affect his relationships with the studio, especially with the more bureaucratic forces at MGM. Still, studio head Louis B. Mayer, along with the sharp and cultured Irving G. Thalberg, believed in Montgomery's potential. They saw him as a versatile actor who could be valuable in a variety of roles. In 1929, Montgomery had a major opportunity as the leading man in Untamed, starring Joan Crawford. This marked the beginning of a pattern in his career, playing sophisticated yet down-on-his-luck men. In Untamed, he portrayed Andy, a charming but impoverished man who catches the eye of Crawford, a wild heiress from South America who comes to New York to refine her manners. Photoplay magazine noted, "Robert Montgomery, the hero, is in for a load of fan mail." While Robert Montgomery's career on screen was thriving, his personal life took a horrifying turn. In January 1930, his 11-month-old daughter suddenly died. Montgomery chose to keep his grief to himself, refusing to speak about the loss and burying his emotions deep inside. Around the same time, he met James Cagney. Cagney, having experienced his own share of personal tragedy, shared an understanding with Montgomery. The two became unlikely friends. Instead of letting his sorrow eat away at him, Montgomery threw himself into his work with renewed focus. His return to the screen began with the light 1930 musical comedy, Free and Easy, which received decent reviews, including recognition from Photoplay magazine, who listed it among the best films of the month. Not long after, Norma Shearer, looking to break free from her image as a perfect on-screen lady, persuaded her husband, Irving Thalberg, to secure the film rights to Ursula Parrott's novel, Ex-Wife, for a new project, the divorcee. She chose Montgomery to play opposite her. In June 1930, Robert stepped away from comedy for the first time in The Big House, a drama where he portrayed Kent Marlowe, a man sentenced to prison for manslaughter after a drunk driving accident on New Year's Eve. The film's harsh and gritty portrayal of prison life helped set the stage for the rise of gangster films throughout the 1930s. Despite this, MGM continued to mold him as a light comedy debonair. In Sins of the Children, he played a spoiled, wealthy young man who refuses to marry a girl after compromising her. Then he reunited with Joan Crawford in Our Blushing Brides, where he played the charming, well-to-do son of a department store owner. Montgomery rounded out 1930 with a musical comedy, Love in the Rough, set in upscale country clubs, and a war drama, War Nurse. By this time, he had firmly established himself as a leading actor within the MGM roster, earning top billing in both films. Away from the screen, Montgomery was becoming known for his elegant lifestyle. Whether at home in the Hollywood Hills, surrounded by his collection of fine etchings, or enjoying a game of tennis, he lived in true Hollywood aristocrat fashion. He also had a penchant for fast cars, owning one of the first Bentleys in the city. And on Sundays he played polo, a sport that was by then very popular among the Hollywood elite. When Robert learned that his next role would be opposite Greta Garbo, he was both excited and intimidated by the idea of working with her. She was at the peak of her fame, the biggest movie star in the world. The icy Garbo made Montgomery feel professionally dwarfed. On his first day on set, he arrived in a carefully chosen blue suit, a white shirt with a striped tie, and a monogrammed handkerchief neatly tucked into his breast pocket. The studio crew, accustomed to his impeccable appearance, teased him about the handkerchief, asking if he chose an initialed one in case Garbo forgot who he was. This comment touched a nerve as a clearly embarrassed Montgomery said, "This is because I have a cold." Their film, Inspiration, was one of the 6 films Garbo completed during a particularly busy 2-year period, and it was not one to enhance her legendary status. The film was a disappointing attempt at portraying Garbo's character as a tragic romantic figure. It fell flat in almost every way. Montgomery's performance, too, seemed out of place. His portrayal was so misaligned with the character that it was clear to the audience he struggled to make the role believable. As New York Times critic Mordaunt Hall remarked, "Virtually all Mr. Montgomery succeeds in impressing upon the audience is his embarrassment." In his next role, MGM cast Robert Montgomery opposite the popular Constance Bennett, who was also at the height of her fame in 1931. The film, The Easiest Way, was marketed as the frank, fearless drama of a woman who sinned. That same year, Montgomery reunited with Norma Shearer for Strangers May Kiss, another light-hearted comedy. However, Montgomery began to grow frustrated with the parade of uninspired roles being offered to him. It didn't take long for him to notice the meteoric rise of Clark Gable at MGM. Gable was taking on high-profile parts alongside top actresses like Shearer, Marion Davies, Joan Crawford, and Jean Harlow. Although Montgomery knew he wasn't suited for the rugged, macho roles that Gable was excelling in, he still believed he was capable of handling more dynamic roles than the affluent, carefree characters he was being typecast as. Just when it seemed that Montgomery had reached his limit, Norma Shearer stepped in to help. For her own reasons, she chose Robert to play opposite her in the screen adaptation of Noel Coward's Private Lives. Shearer thought that he was the ideal choice to play her counterpart in the sophisticated comedy about marriage. Robert's first film in 1932, Lovers Courageous, saw him once again in the role of a wealthy playboy. Then in The Flesh is Weak, he portrayed a penniless man who, despite his financial troubles, manages to impress Nora Gregor, a Vienna theater actress, by wooing her in elegant evening wear. He next appeared in Letty Linton, a film starring Joan Crawford, where Montgomery had a secondary role as Hale Darrow, a suave man who meets Crawford's character aboard a luxury ship and proposes to her before they dock in New York. By this time, Robert felt confident in his standing as a bankable movie star. He felt his hard work and willingness to accept roles that other debonair stars would have turned their nose up at merited some recognition. Being a man of high breeding, he was certainly confident enough to walk right into the studio and ask for it. So that's what he intended to do. He showed up one afternoon at Louis B. Mayer's office and politely requested a salary increase. However, Mayer, somewhat less politely, flatly refused. An argument broke out and Montgomery took issue with Mayer's uncouth way of speaking. Soon the intimidating 6'1" Montgomery was leaning over the desk of his 5'6" opponent. He eyeballed Mayer and told him, "If you were a younger man, Mr. Mayer, I'd give you a beating." Mayer, perhaps a bit intimidated, did allow Robert to have a barber's chair placed in his dressing room for his comfort during makeup. But that was the only concession he made. The threat, if anything, had now turned Mayer against Montgomery for life. He wasn't in danger of being fired, though. Despite Robert's complaints about his artistic direction at MGM and Mayer's frustrations with his difficult star, both understood the value the other brought. Both parties knew they needed each other. With Irving Thalberg's encouragement, Mayer continued to pair Montgomery with MGM's leading ladies, many of whom requested him specifically. Montgomery's 1932 film slate continued with Blondie of the Follies, in which he starred alongside Marion Davies and Tallulah Bankhead. Both actresses were incredibly talented but struggled to find the right material to showcase their abilities. Blondie of the Follies was a vehicle for Davies, who had self-produced the film, but it received mixed reviews. Faithless, his film with Bankhead, was a critical disaster, even though Bankhead and Montgomery gave good performances. New York Times critic Mordaunt Hall described the film as a lumbering species of drama, but acknowledged that both Montgomery and Bankhead were, quote, wasted on inferior material. Before I go on with the next phase of Robert Montgomery's intriguing career and his shift to political radicalism, I'd like to make a special announcement. We've launched a brand new channel entitled Rock and Roll Mysteries. The format is very similar to what you are used to at Hollywood Mysteries. Deep dives into the scandalous, tragic, brilliant, and mysterious lives of some great people, only this time it's musical stars. We've already put out a video on Marianne Faithfull, which you can find linked on screen now. The only major difference is I'll be handing narrating duties over to our resident music history expert, so I can stay focused on Hollywood Mysteries. I'd be delighted if you can stop by the channel and watch a video, subscribe, and even leave a comment. Growing a new channel from zero is a lot of work, so any support is a huge help. Thanks so much to all of you who have subscribed already, and don't forget to stop by the Hollywood Mysteries store where we have these 100% exclusive t-shirts on sale. But for now, let's get back to Robert Montgomery. By the early 1930s, most of Hollywood's top stars were members of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which, while a form of industry organization, offered little protection to the lower-tier actors and extras. In 1933, estimates suggested that between 22,000 and 24,000 actors lived in Hollywood, all hoping to capitalize on the supposed riches of the film industry. Extras who had little hope of finding steady work would line up at the central casting agency for days on end, hoping to be chosen for just a few hours of work. On average, only about 600 extras were hired per day, and many of them, bartenders, cab drivers, and waiters, were merely taking a day off from their regular jobs to earn a little extra cash. Robert Montgomery, who would become a vocal advocate for the rights of these workers, once shared with Collier's magazine writer, Alva Johnston. Top pay for any extra was $10 a day, and an extra was lucky to get 3 days' worth a month. Most of these extras were not actors, and had no ambition to be actors. Barbers and cab drivers and waiters were all registered with Central Casting. If they were called, they'd just take a day off from their regular jobs to pick up some extra money. Real actors and actresses, people who had been trained for years in their profession, were registered too, but it seemed as if the amateurs were called more often. In 1933, the Screen Actors Guild was founded in collaboration with the American Federation of Labor, aiming to protect the professional actors in the industry. James Cagney, who witnessed the disparity firsthand, explained the situation to Montgomery, who until then had been leading a comfortable life with little concern for anything beyond polo, clothing, and cars. "It's all right for us," Cagney told him. Hell, we're overpaid anyhow. But those poor devils can't do anything about it. If they squawk, they get fired. Cagney pointed out the plight of the extras who were required to work long hours without rest. Montgomery, inspired by Cagney's words, began to look more closely at the issue. He quickly realized Cagney was right and decided to leave the Academy in favor of joining SAG. His decision shocked Hollywood's conservative circles, especially since Montgomery had long been seen as a privileged actor. Despite this, he became a passionate and articulate advocate for the rights of the lower-tier actors and extras in the industry. Amid his labor activism, Montgomery and his wife Elizabeth welcomed their second daughter on April 14, 1933. In 1933, Montgomery starred in Hell Below, a gritty wartime drama that was a change from his usual roles. Directed by Jack Conway, the film was set at an Allied naval base in the Mediterranean during World War I in 1917 and 1918. Montgomery played Lieutenant Knowlton, who defies his commanding officer, played by Walter Houston, and is dishonorably discharged. He dies heroically after sneaking back onto a submarine. The New York Evening Post wrote that he was, quote, more mature and virile than this reviewer ever remembers him. Montgomery handles the feature role, giving an uncommonly restrained and authentic portrayal. During filming, Montgomery had to fend off a few real-life dangers, including an unscheduled dive by the submarine that left him clinging to the periscope until it was raised in time to save him from drowning. He was also slightly burned by acid used in a smokescreen sequence. Later that year, Montgomery starred in When Ladies Meet, opposite Myrna Loy, and followed it with Maid on Broadway. Montgomery then had the opportunity to work with his favorite actress, Helen Hayes. He admitted that Hayes was his preferred screen partner. She had won an Oscar for her role in The Sin of Madeleine Claudette from 1931, but since then had struggled to win decent roles. Together they appeared in Another Language, a romantic drama written by Rose Franken, and later in Night Flight, a film adapted from the novel by French aviator Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. In February 1934, Robert was elected to represent his fellow actors on the Actor-Producer 5-5 Committee under the National Recovery Administration. This committee was tasked with negotiating for better working conditions and fair pay in the industry. Later that year, Montgomery further showed his political involvement by endorsing Upton Sinclair, the Democratic nominee for California governor. Sinclair, a writer and reformer, proposed the End Poverty in California platform, though he was ultimately unsuccessful in the election. Montgomery's political involvement continued, and in 1934 he was elected vice president of the Screen Actors Guild. Throughout 1934, Montgomery's roles largely remained in the realm of light comedy. In Fugitive Lovers, he played an innocent man on the run from the law, romantically pursuing Madge Evans. The film was at least notable for Montgomery's departure from his usual suave appearance. Critics noted that he appeared gaunt, harassed, worried, and unshaven throughout most of the film. He next starred in The Mystery of Mr. X, a film set in foggy London where a series of homicides have left 5 police officers dead, each killed by a sword cane. Later that year, Montgomery reunited with Norma Shearer in Riptide, which was meant to be a grand comeback for Shearer, following her time away from the screen to care for her ill husband, Irving Thalberg. Riptide was supposed to be a lavish drawing room romance, set among the British elite in high society, but its release was poorly timed. By 1934, moviegoers have shifted their taste due to the Great Depression, and the film failed. In 1934, Hideout was filmed partially on location in Santa Cruz, California, and directed by W.S. Van Dyke II. Though the film had an efficient guide in Van Dyke, it lacked the spark of imagination seen in his previous works, like Manhattan Melodrama and The Thin Man, both of which starred William Powell, who had recently moved to MGM and was now receiving prime roles that had once been earmarked for Montgomery. During this time, Montgomery's contract with MGM was up for renegotiation. Mayer offered him a new deal, and this time he successfully negotiated an increase of $25,000 to his annual salary, bringing it to $200,000. In the mid-1930s, Montgomery played a variety of roles. In Forsaking All Others in 1934, he portrayed Dill Todd, a selfish man who deserts Joan Crawford on the eve of their wedding. He followed this with the forgettable Biography of a Bachelor Girl. Later that year, he appeared in Vanessa, Her Love Story, where he played the roommate of Helen Hayes, though the film did little to highlight his talents. Meanwhile, Montgomery was more intensely advocating for better paying conditions for bit players, a stance that led to serious tensions with Hollywood executives, who labeled him and his supporters Bolshevistic. In early 1936, Robert and his wife welcomed their son, Robert Jr., on January 6th. Around this time, Montgomery fulfilled a long-held dream of owning a mansion in the New York countryside, purchasing a property in Towners, New York. He enjoyed his time there, raising ponies, creating game preserves, growing apples, and indulging in pheasant hunting. He admitted in interviews that his secret ambition was to write and direct films, alongside his acting career, and he confessed to envying multi-talented figures like Noel Coward. Frank Curran of Brooks Brothers once praised Montgomery's fashion sense, calling him the best-dressed man he had ever seen. Montgomery was known for his impeccable style, purchasing clothes from Brooks Brothers and MacDonald Heath's, and shoes from Maxwell's of London. Despite being a heavy smoker, he was meticulous about the appearance of his suits, never keeping cigarettes in his pockets to avoid disturbing their drape. Instead, he would carry them in his hand or borrow from friends. Montgomery was also a proponent of catnaps, once saying, "Sleep is the big thing, of course. I'd have folded up long ago if it hadn't been for the catnaps. But I've depended on other things too, reading, for example. If I can pick up a book and read, the whole world can blow up around me and I won't be aware of it." In 1936, Montgomery starred in Petticoat Fever, and then in Piccadilly Gym, the latter of which was a solid comedy based on a P.G. Wodehouse novel, though MGM did little to promote it. By 1937, Montgomery's status at MGM had reached a plateau. The death of Irving Thalberg in September 1936 left Montgomery without an advocate in the studio. Louis B. Mayer, who still hated Montgomery over his salary demands and his activism with the Screen Actors Guild, was growing more frustrated with him. Though MGM no longer seemed reliant on Montgomery's services, his star power was still seen as valuable enough to retain, as long as he could be kept under control. 1937's The Last of Mrs. Cheney demonstrated the diminishing treatment Montgomery was receiving from the studio. Adapted from Frederick Lonsdale's play, the film was intended as a vehicle for Joan Crawford, with Montgomery relegated to a smaller role. Though the film featured an impressive cast, including William Powell and Crawford, Montgomery's part was reduced to that of a charming but secondary character. The year before, Robert had visited New York City and became fascinated by a play called Night Must Fall, written by and starring Emlyn Williams. The play, which featured a homicidal maniac carrying his latest victim's head in a hatbox, inspired Montgomery to push for the film's rights, hoping to escape the typecasting that had plagued his career. MGM agreed to purchase the rights, likely hoping that the difficulty of the role would humble Montgomery. As he later explained, "They okayed my playing in it because they thought the fan reaction to me, in such a role, would humiliate me." Filming for Night Must Fall began in January 1937, with Dame May Whitty reprising her stage role as an elderly hypochondriac who befriends a former hotel page boy, only to be murdered by him. When the film premiered at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood on May 4, 1937, 5 days after its New York debut, MGM took the unusual step of distributing handbills to theatergoers, disowning the film. A trailer for the film was also shown, disclaiming the studio's responsibility for what was about to be seen. Not exactly genius marketing. However, these precautions were soon abandoned when the film won rave reviews. Time magazine, for instance, wrote, "Any picture in which Robert Montgomery, whose previous contribution to the screen has been a 7-year marathon of ingenuous charm, gives a first-rate performance in a different role, rates as at least a major surprise." Otis Ferguson from the New Republic called it one of the most vivid and powerful effects the films have managed. Night Must Fall was also one of the early entries into the psychological chiller genre, and it became Robert Montgomery's personal favorite. Montgomery said, "The part of the murderer was a challenge to any actor. You see, no one on the screen knows that the man is the murderer. The audience knows it though, and the hard part is to make the audience like the character." After watching the film, James Cagney complimented him, saying, "You've given the rest of us something to shoot at. Boy, you are an actor." Montgomery's performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Though he lost to Spencer Tracy, who won for Captains Courageous, some have speculated that MGM executives might have leaned on Academy voters to award Tracy instead, just to spite Montgomery. MGM were uninterested in further pursuing Montgomery's newfound dramatic success. Instead, they assigned him yet another one-dimensional role, this time in The Bride Wore Red, opposite Joan Crawford. It would have been their 7th film together, but by now Montgomery had had enough and he refused the part. The role eventually went to Robert Young. As a form of punishment, he was loaned out to Warner Brothers for an even worse comedy, Ever Since Eve. Ever Since Eve starred Marion Davies, who, in a bid to avoid further competition with Norma Shearer and to prevent more conflicts between William Randolph Hearst and Louis B. Mayer, had moved to Warner Brothers. Her films there, however, were of poor quality. Ever Since Eve was among the worst of these films, and it was the final, unfortunate chapter in Davies' career. In May 1937, a major strike involving 6,000 painters, makeup artists, and other studio technicians took place, demanding union recognition and better working conditions. SAG members, led by Montgomery, considered joining the strike, which would have shut down all film production. Montgomery worked tirelessly to negotiate a deal with the producers, ultimately achieving an agreement that included higher wages for extras, a guild shop, and overtime pay. After this victory, Montgomery's next 2 films in 1938 were something of a hard bump back down to earth. Live, Love, and Learn was a meek comedy, although Yellow Jack received a mildly positive review from Newsweek, which stated, "Robert Montgomery again gives a fine performance in a dramatic role." In 1939, Montgomery was back fighting for better working conditions. On May 9, 1939, a meeting took place at Louis B. Mayer's beach house in Santa Monica. During the meeting, Montgomery and the SAG team presented their demands, and the studio agreed to recognize the guild. However, there was some underhanded maneuvering. Montgomery sensed that some of the individuals involved, such as Willie Beoff and George Brown, were not truly on the side of the actors. "Behind that friend of labor routine, I sniffed the rank stench of crook," Montgomery told his associate. 3 weeks later, Beoff called the SAG office, requesting that a suspended member be reinstated. Montgomery's response was sharp. "The only way I can explain the stupidity of your message is that some oaf in your office got the wrong number." This exchange sparked a series of events that escalated into a union war. Beoff, who ostensibly represented a rival union, took out ads claiming that his organization would represent the actors. Although Robert and others sensed that Mayer had been at work and was behind this new union, which would end up being tightly controlled by the studio, this prompted Montgomery to take matters into his own hands and file a suit. It soon turned out that Beoff and co. were ready to play hardball. In fact, they were ready to do anything to get rid of Montgomery. His Bentley's tires and seats were slashed, and most shockingly, a bomb was found later in a guild car that was sometimes used by Montgomery and other important representatives of the union. An enraged Montgomery borrowed $5,000 from the guild to hire former FBI agents to investigate Beoff's connections, which led to the discovery of links to the Al Capone syndicate. The evidence was handed over to journalist Westbrook Pegler, whose explosive reports eventually resulted in Beoff, Brown, and others being convicted and sentenced to prison. Pegler was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative work. This time, Montgomery truly got the upper hand and left Mayer in a state of near apoplexy. In 1939 and 1940, Robert starred in Fast and Loose, a comedy mystery sequel to Fast Company, where he and Rosalind Russell played a married couple who solved a case involving a missing Shakespeare manuscript. Later, he filmed Haunted Honeymoon in England, a delayed production caused by the outbreak of World War II. Then, in The Earl of Chicago, he portrayed a charming bootlegger who inherits a British title. He also appeared in The Lion Has Wings and took part in Rage in Heaven, a darker drama with Ingrid Bergman. At Columbia, he played a prizefighter whose soul enters heaven early in Here Comes Mr. Jordan, which got him his second Academy Award nomination. His final role of 1941, Unfinished Business, cast him as a rich playboy in a farce with Irene Dunne. Meanwhile, in 1940, Montgomery, always a visceral patriot, became involved in World War II, volunteering with the American Field Service in France. He later wrote an open letter to a German hero for Colliers, which recounted his harrowing experiences on the front lines of the German invasion. Returning to Hollywood, he began to complain about the poor quality of films being made by then, writing, "I am convinced that the weakness of leadership under which, to my knowledge, this industry has been struggling is directly responsible for the poor quality of its average product." It was another clear dig at Mayer. He supported Republican Wendell Willkie in the 1940 presidential election, even taking on the role of chairing Hollywood's Republican committee. This switch to Republican support took people by surprise, and Willkie was quick to ally himself with the famous star, similar to how Democrats were eager to remind people that Katharine Hepburn was a Roosevelt supporter. Jimmy Fidler, the most powerful journalist in Hollywood at that time, sent Montgomery an expensive watch in the hope of bribing him back to the Democrat cause. Montgomery immediately returned it, along with a note telling Fidler exactly where he could shove his watch. On August 1, 1941, Robert Montgomery was commissioned as a lieutenant in the U.S. Naval Reserve and began his duties as an assistant naval attaché at the U.S. Embassy in London. With his contract on a 14-week leave of absence, he jokingly told reporters, "I'm washed up with Hollywood for the duration." His intelligence work involved overseeing the Naval Operations Room, where British ship locations were tracked. He later requested an indefinite leave from MGM, and in November 1941 was ordered to Washington, D.C. There, he set up a similar operations room for President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a man he had not supported in the 1940 election. Montgomery soon requested sea duty and underwent training at the Torpedo Boat School in Connecticut. He first commanded PT boats in the Panama Canal, and later saw action in the Pacific at Guadalcanal and the Marshall Islands, eventually being promoted to lieutenant commander. By April 1943, Montgomery returned to Hollywood after recovering from malaria, having lost 22 pounds during his 2-year absence. After resting for a month, he underwent further sea training before serving as operations officer aboard a destroyer. He was among the first to enter Cherbourg during the D-Day invasion, earning the Bronze Star for his meritorious achievement. Montgomery returned to the U.S. in late 1944, still on active duty rosters. A few months later, he rejoined MGM, playing Navy Lieutenant John Brickley, and They Were Expendable. This role, closely aligned with his own experiences, remains one of his most remembered performances. The film where Montgomery and co-star John Wayne play PT boat commanders during the Bataan evacuation was directed by John Ford. After Ford broke his leg during filming, Montgomery stepped in to direct, and Ford later commented that he couldn't tell where his direction ended and Montgomery's began. The Saturday Evening Post praised the film, calling it the closest thing to a perfect movie this year. They Were Expendable grossed over $3.25 million in domestic revenues, and Montgomery was promoted to full commander by the Navy. During this time, Montgomery also resumed his involvement with the Screen Actors Guild. In 1946, he was elected president of the Guild for a 4th term. That year, a strike over union job classifications hit Hollywood, and Montgomery penned an article for Life magazine on October 14, 1946, in which he stated that the Guild rigorously opposes any fascist or communist influence in the industry or the ranks of labor. Montgomery's directorial debut came with Lady in the Lake in 1947, a distinctive film noir based on the famous Raymond Chandler novel that was filmed entirely on a closed MGM soundstage. The movie was praised for its unique approach, with Newsweek calling it a brilliant tour de force, and noting that it showed Hollywood was still willing to push creative boundaries. Montgomery played the role of Detective Philip Marlowe, whose investigation uncovers a series of murders. What set the film apart was its experimental technique. Montgomery, or the camera itself, was the primary presence on screen, with Montgomery appearing only twice, including in a brief sequence in front of a mirror. After the war, Montgomery found it difficult to maintain the youthful aristocratic playboy roles that had once been his signature. His service years had aged him rapidly, as was the case with so many young men who had gone to war. Hollywood itself was evolving, and the roles that had once suited him were now outdated. As the post-war film landscape embraced tougher, more masculine characters, Montgomery followed in the footsteps of actor Dick Powell, who reinvented himself as a gritty leading man. Montgomery, too, abandoned his debonair image, moving into tough guy roles, whether in war dramas or film noirs. His commanding screen presence, reinforced by his 6'1" frame and a face that conveyed both vulnerability and hardened maturity, made him a perfect fit for these new types of roles. Lady in the Lake was one of the finest examples of this. However, the studio was eager to revert him back to familiar territory, so they cast him opposite Greer Garson in Desire Me, a love story that had George Cukor at the helm. Montgomery hated the direction the film was taking, and he quit. Richard Hart replaced him in the role, and the film was pretty much forgotten. So instead, he directed and starred in Ride the Pink Horse for Universal International. The film, which was based on a Ben Hecht and Charles Lederer screenplay, deserves more recognition for its direction and photography by Russell Meddy. Later in 1947, Montgomery was called to testify at the House Caucus hearings concerning communism in Hollywood. He argued that the film industry should handle its own issues with communism, rather than the government stepping in. Montgomery's final task at MGM was narrating The Secret Land, a U.S. Navy documentary about Admiral Byrd's expeditions to Antarctica. The documentary, which impressed many with its incredible polar photography, was at long last the end of his long association with the studio. Montgomery realized that the studio's future under Dore Schary was unlikely to offer him the types of roles he desired. He decided to move on, and it was a huge relief not to have to push himself through any more tedious movies. In 1948, Montgomery directed The Saxon Charm, and he also starred opposite Anne Blythe in Once More My Darling, a film about a young woman infatuated with an older movie star. Neither film was a hit. He was not only disillusioned with MGM, but with California. He was yearning to return to New York full-time, only he did not want to take Elizabeth with him. So in 1949, Robert Montgomery moved to New York, leaving behind his wife and 2 surviving children, Elizabeth and Robert Jr. His marriage had failed, a fact that he had kept secret from almost everyone. He was also unsure of what to do with his career. Politics had been his main passion for the last decade or so, but he needed to act to earn money, so he struck a deal with Britain's Eagle Lion Films to both direct and star in Your Witness, released as Eyewitness in the US in 1950, a project that would turn out to be his final appearance on the big screen. However, just before leaving for London, Montgomery received an interesting offer from the Lee Hat Company to replace Drew Pearson as a commentator on the ABC radio network. He eagerly accepted, using the platform to speak his mind each Thursday evening. His show, Robert Montgomery Speaking, debuted in September 1949, and he became a popular political commentator, particularly for his salvos against Britain's turn to socialism at that time. In January 1950, he was appointed as an executive producer advisor at NBC Television, and also became the host of Robert Montgomery Presents. The program, which premiered on January 30th, 1950, featured Montgomery hosting bi-weekly dramatic plays, with the first episode starring Madeleine Carroll in the letter. The show also gave a debut to his daughter, Elizabeth, who had grown up to be a charismatic and beautiful woman by 18. However, Robert had been reluctant to let her on the show. He had hoped she would stay away from show business altogether, marry well, and never have to bother with work. But Elizabeth had her own mind and was very much a young woman of the independent-minded generation of 1950s teenagers. Given how intimidated she was by her father, it's impressive she was able to convince him to let her make her debut. She would go on to become a major star in Bewitched, but her personal life was one of turmoil. She never won her father's approval, and openly admitted she was hopelessly drawn to tyrannical older men throughout her life, many of whom were abusive to her. But I'll make a whole video on Elizabeth at some point in the future, where I'll get more into detail on her. So stay tuned for that. In December 1950, Elizabeth filed for divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty, and custody of their children was granted to her. Just days after the divorce was finalized, Montgomery married Elizabeth Grant Harkness, better known as Buffy, the divorced wife of Standard Oil magnate William Harkness. The couple wed quietly in Sag Harbor, New York, with only a few friends present. In 1952, they purchased a 400-acre farm in Millbrook, New York, which became their retreat from city life. After his movie career wound down, Robert Montgomery worked full-time on politics, Broadway, and television. It was his political work that turned out to be surprisingly revolutionary, after he made a move that still affects how we perceive presidents today. In 1954, Montgomery took on an unpaid position as a media consultant for President Dwight D. Eisenhower. This might not sound too unusual today, but it was unheard of at the time. Few leaders had given much thought to television beyond its possibilities for mass communication. Montgomery knew the tricks of the trade and persuaded Eisenhower that it would be in his interest if he began to present himself on television in a way that would cause audiences to favor him. These days, the idea that any politician would appear on TV or engage in social media without the advice and vetting of a media team the size of a small army is almost unheard of. But it was Robert Montgomery who first saw the value in this and offered his expertise for free to President Eisenhower. Soon his position became invaluable. Throughout his later years, Montgomery led a quieter life. He resided in retirement in Canaan, Connecticut, with his second wife, Buffy. In the 1970s, he underwent major surgery to remove his bladder due to a tumor. Robert Montgomery passed away from cancer on September 27, 1981, at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in Manhattan. He was cremated and his ashes were given to his family. Tragically, both of his surviving children, Elizabeth and Robert Montgomery Jr., also died from cancer. Montgomery embodied the qualities of power and respectability. His military service, charismatic presence, and vocal support for populist causes cemented his status as someone who understood the workings of power. As a public figure, Montgomery prided himself on being a respectable individual, but he also carried a sharp edge and was a man who could not be intimidated. He did what he felt was right and just, and cared little for public pressure to conform. Montgomery was, in many ways, the epitome of a respectable heel. That's about all for this episode. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you again next Saturday. Until then, sweet dreams.